Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
You ever have one of those birthdays where the silence is so loud, it actually drowns out every other sound in the house? Where the day feels like any other Tuesday or Thursday or whatever, but somehow worse, because deep down you remember that once, just once, you wanted it to matter. That was me, sitting on the edge of my bed at 7:42 in the morning, staring at the peeling edge of wallpaper like it might suddenly come to life and wish me a happy birthday, since no one else had bothered to. I'm 43 years old. Not 20, not 30, 43, an age where the candles don't matter, the gifts stop coming, and people stop pretending like you're still becoming something. You are what you are now. Set. Cemented. And what I am, apparently, is the daughter people forget about. The sister people glance over. The woman people expect to just keep going without so much as a pat on the back. That's what stung the most. There wasn't even malice in the forgetting. Just absence. I wasn't hated. I was invisible. And you can't fight invisibility. I could hear them downstairs. Mom, Diana, though I'd never dare call her that to her face, laughing her throaty, performative laugh that she only uses when Emily is around. They were clinking glasses. Orange juice, probably, or some mimosa she made to feel festive about nothing at all. I heard a pan sizzling and my sister's high-pitched giggle that always made her sound like she was 12 again, even though she's 36 with her own house, her own dog, and, of course, her own pedestal in our mother's eyes. Emily has always been the golden one, bright, charming, fragile enough to protect, but beautiful enough to display. I, on the other hand, was always the one cleaning up after the party, metaphorically and literally. It's not like I was expecting balloons or anything. I've never been that kind of person. But you'd think, just once, someone would say, "Hey Lena, happy birthday," or maybe offer me a slice of that breakfast casserole they were making. Instead, I sat there in silence until noon, stomach hollow, scrolling through Facebook like some middle-aged ghost, watching other people's lives sparkle with parties and flowers and handmade cards. And what did I have? A cracked mug of coffee I made myself and the faint scent of hairspray drifting upstairs because Emily always overdoes it, even if she's just going to Target. By late afternoon, I'd gone full numb. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I just stopped expecting anything. It's a little like getting locked out of your own house. At first, you're banging on the door, trying every window. After a while, you just sit on the curb, realizing no one inside hears you. Or worse, maybe they do and just don't care enough to open the door. I walked downstairs around 5, partly because I couldn't stand the smell of their dinner anymore, partly because some stupid part of me thought, maybe, just maybe, there's a surprise waiting. There wasn't. The table was set for 2. Not 3. Emily was wearing one of those soft sweaters that probably cost $100, but made her look effortlessly cozy, like the kind of woman you see in coffee ads. Mom was opening a bottle of wine. Neither of them looked up right away. When they finally noticed me, it was like I'd startled them out of a movie. Emily smiled faintly, more reflex than anything. Mom said, "Oh, you're up," like I'd overslept instead of hiding upstairs all day trying not to cry into my tea-stained pillow. I opened my mouth. Closed it. Nothing to say. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound like a child? Dinner was awkward. I didn't sit at the table. I took a plate into the living room, which is where I always eat when they're having their little bonding sessions. That's when I started thinking about all the other birthdays. When I was 10, I baked my own cake because Mom forgot and Emily had a dance recital. When I was 24, they planned a surprise brunch for Emily's new promotion on my birthday weekend. When I turned 30, I got a sweater 2 sizes too small and no card. Last year, they said they were so sorry for forgetting and took me to a diner 2 days later, where Mom spent most of the time talking about how stressed Emily had been lately. I smiled through all of it. Like I always do. Around 9, I heard the soft knock on my door. I didn't answer right away. I knew it was Mom. Her knock is delicate, like she's the guest in your home and doesn't want to intrude. I said nothing. She pushed the door open and stood there, holding a mug of tea, her usual peace offering. Chamomile, probably. Her version of a Band-Aid. I thought you might like something warm, she said, her voice tinged with a kind of guilt so rehearsed it barely counted. She didn't say the words. Not happy birthday, not I'm sorry, not even a half-assed we forgot. Just stood there, offering that mug like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I took it, looked her in the eye, said thank you, even though my voice cracked. I wanted to throw it across the room. I wanted to ask her if she even remembered why today hurt. But I just took the mug and closed the door after she left. I stared at it for a while. The steam curled upward like some fragile smoke signal, trying to reach a mother who wasn't listening. Emily knocked 5 minutes later. She wanted to borrow some Advil, said she felt like she was coming down with something. I handed her the mug without thinking. Or maybe I did think. Maybe part of me, deep down in the pit where all the resentment lived, wanted her to take it. Wanted her to hold something that was meant for me. Like I've done my whole life. She smiled, took it, and said, thanks, you're the best, like I was her assistant and not her sister. She walked off, sipping it slowly. I sat back down on my bed and listened to the sound of her slippers moving down the hallway. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel cruel. I just felt quiet. Quieter than I've ever felt in my life. And then, maybe 10 minutes later, I heard it. The coughing. Soft at first. Then sharper. More frantic. And then the sound of Mom's voice rising, panicked. Something dropped, glass maybe. Footsteps. Emily gasping, sputtering. I didn't move. I just sat there. Still holding the empty handle of what used to be my mug. Still staring at the peeling wallpaper. Still wondering if, maybe, they finally noticed I was in the house. There's a sound a person makes when their body realizes something is wrong before their brain does. A sort of half-swallowed breath that catches in the throat like it was never meant to be there. And when I heard that sound coming from the hallway, sharp and dry and sudden, I knew. Without standing, without asking, without even blinking, that it was Emily, and something inside her had shifted from comfort to chaos. It didn't start with a scream or a crash or anything overly dramatic. It started with that simple, jarring cough, the kind you'd normally ignore, except this time it carried weight and urgency. A thread of fear so thin it might have gone unnoticed if you weren't already listening for it. I stayed in my room. Not because I was paralyzed, not because I didn't care, and certainly not because I didn't understand what might be happening, but because something about the moment felt deserved, not earned, not orchestrated, not maliciously delivered, but deserved in the quiet, cosmic way that pain returns to those who've never had to carry it. I could hear her now, coughing harder, each breath jagged and desperate, and then came the thud, barely audible, like someone leaning against the wall or dropping to the floor. I couldn't be sure, but it was followed by a new sound, one I'd recognize anywhere. My mother's voice, shrill and cracking in a way I hadn't heard since I was a child and broke my arm falling off the swing set while she was too busy talking on the phone to notice. Emily? Emily, what's wrong? She shouted, not in command but in fear, her footsteps pounding down the hall like she was running toward a burning building she never thought would catch fire. Her panic, real and raw, rang through the walls, echoing down the staircase and into the pit of my stomach, and for the briefest moment, I felt the instinct rise in me, the one trained by years of being the quiet fixer, the helper, the invisible buffer between disaster and denial, but I squashed it before it took root, sat back on the edge of my bed, and folded my hands. I could hear them now, both of them, Emily gasping, Mom pleading, their voices tangled in a dance of confusion and fear that would have shattered me once, would have sent me into a flurry of action, fetching water, calling someone, doing anything to make it better. But not this time. This time I stayed still, not out of cruelty, but because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one trying to solve a problem I didn't cause. I wasn't the one rushing in to make things right for people who'd never even noticed how often I did. It's strange what you remember in moments like that. I remembered being 11 years old, watching Emily tear up Mom's favorite blouse during a tantrum because she couldn't go to a sleepover, and how I ended up grounded for not stopping her. I remembered being 16 and giving up my spot at a summer writing camp because Emily failed her driving test and needed someone to keep her company while Mom went on her business trip. I remembered 29, when I got engaged to a man who left me 2 months later after meeting Emily at a family dinner and decided she was easier to love. I remembered all of it, not with bitterness, not with the sting of fresh wounds, but with the numb clarity of someone who finally understood the price of being second, always second, no matter how kind, how loyal, how present you were. When the coughing subsided into a mix of gasps and sobs, and I heard my mother shout to someone on the phone, probably poison control, maybe an ambulance, I couldn't be sure. I stood, slowly, and walked to the edge of the hallway, not enough to be seen, just close enough to watch. Emily was hunched over, eyes wide, face red and streaked with tears, clutching her stomach like it had turned against her. Mom was on her knees beside her, holding her, rocking slightly, her phone wedged between her shoulder and ear, her voice shaking as she gave details I couldn't quite make out. I could feel her looking for me without turning. It's a mother's instinct, I suppose, to sense a presence even when your back is turned, especially when guilt sits like a brick in your throat. She didn't call my name, didn't ask for help. She just looked up, finally turning her head, eyes locking with mine in a moment that stretched far beyond the hallway, far beyond the years we'd wasted pretending everything was fine. And in that look, I saw everything she never said, the apologies withheld, the birthdays forgotten, the constant, exhausting performance of motherhood she reserved only for Emily. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. My silence, for once, was louder than any accusation I could have made, louder than any screaming match, any sobbing plea, any desperate question of why her and not me. I just stood there, arms loose at my sides, watching her as she watched me, and in that moment, the air between us became something different, heavier, charged, like a wire that had finally sparked after years of fraying. And the funny thing is, even then, I don't think she really believed I had done anything, not truly, not in her core, because that would require her to admit she had created a daughter capable of silence that dangerous. But the doubt was there, flickering behind her eyes like a candle that refused to die. And that doubt, that unfamiliar, shaking, terrifying doubt, was enough. I turned and walked back into my room, closed the door, sat down, listened as the chaos slowly dulled into background noise, sirens or maybe nothing, crying or maybe silence. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't feel anything but a calm so deep it frightened me a little. Because I hadn't lifted a finger. And yet, I had never felt more powerful in my life. The morning after what some might call an accident and others might quietly categorize as something else entirely arrived not with the soft light of a new day or the hopeful promise of starting over, but with an oppressive stillness that sat over the house like a fog that had no intention of lifting, the kind that seeps through the walls and settles into the corners of your thoughts before you even realize you've been holding your breath. The silence wasn't peaceful, and it wasn't quiet in the comforting sense. It was thick, weighty, like the aftermath of a long, drawn-out scream that had finally gone hoarse. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was anxious or haunted by guilt or even troubled by second thoughts, but because something in me had shifted, something that had remained dormant for far too long. Buried under years of careful words and swallowed feelings and obedient nods, and now that it had awakened, it demanded my full attention, not in a loud or disruptive way, but in the slow, certain manner of something that knew it had every right to exist. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the occasional creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs, and the unmistakable sound of my mother pacing in the hallway just outside my room, her footsteps tentative and uneven, like she couldn't decide whether she wanted to knock on my door or run in the opposite direction. Eventually, she knocked. It was soft, barely a touch, like she was testing the idea of confronting me rather than fully committing to it, and when I didn't answer right away, she waited, holding her breath, the silence between us stretching like a thread pulled too tight. I could almost feel her hand hovering just inches from the doorknob, her mind racing with 1,000 half-formed questions, none of which she had the courage to voice. After a long pause, I finally said, "Come in," and the door opened so slowly I wondered if she might change her mind halfway through. She stood in the doorway like a woman entering a stranger's room, not like a mother checking on her daughter, her face carefully composed, but her eyes giving her away, darting around the room. Taking in every detail as if searching for clues in a crime scene she couldn't quite admit existed. Her mouth opened once, twice, but no words came out, and then finally, in a voice that barely belonged to the woman who raised me, she said, "Why did you give her your tea?" The question wasn't accusatory in tone, but it didn't need to be. Its very existence implied suspicion, and in that moment, I saw just how far the cracks had already spread beneath the surface. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted her to sit with the question for a moment longer, to feel the full weight of what it meant to ask it, to realize the implications of wondering whether your older daughter had intentionally caused harm to your younger one, even if only for a fleeting second. And when I finally answered, my voice was steady, clear, and completely devoid of apology. "She said she wasn't feeling well," I said simply. "I thought she could use something warm." It wasn't a lie, and it wasn't the truth. It was the kind of answer that lives in the space between, where doubt can grow unchecked and every syllable feels like a trap. My mother didn't respond right away, and when she finally did, her voice had a brittle edge to it, like she was afraid to press further, but couldn't stop herself. You wouldn't, she began, but the end of the sentence never came, because she couldn't say it out loud, couldn't bring herself to voice the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the daughter she'd overlooked for most of her life had grown tired of being overlooked. I looked at her then, not with malice, not with rage, but with something colder and far more unsettling: indifference. The kind that comes after all the emotion has been wrung out of you, after the last apology has gone unsaid, after the final opportunity to make things right has quietly expired. "You're asking the wrong question," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "The real question is why you only noticed me when something went wrong." She flinched, just slightly, but enough for me to see it. It was like watching the mask slip for a brief second, revealing the confusion and fear that had always been there, buried under the layers of control and performance she wore like armor. She didn't reply, didn't defend herself, didn't offer up one of her usual lines about how things were different back then, or "you always seemed so independent," or "Emily just needed more." No, this time, she stayed silent, and in that silence, I saw something I'd never seen in her before. Doubt. Not just doubt in me, but doubt in herself. Doubt in the choices she made. Doubt in the woman she had become after decades of choosing one child over the other, and never imagining that choice might come back to stare her in the face with calm, unwavering eyes. She left the room soon after, slowly, her shoulders a little lower, her footsteps a little heavier, like she'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes, and when the door clicked shut behind her, I felt no satisfaction, no pride, just the deep, resonant hum of inevitability. Later that day, I overheard her on the phone, speaking in hushed tones in the kitchen, her voice raw and shaken, words tumbling out in fragments that hinted at uncertainty and fear. She gave it to her, yes, but no, not like that. I don't know, it's just the way she looked at me, and then silence, as if the person on the other end had asked the only question that mattered, and she didn't have an answer. And maybe that was the point. Maybe there wasn't an answer, not one she'd ever be brave enough to say out loud. That night, while she was asleep or pretending to be, I walked into the bathroom with something small, something inconsequential to the eye but heavy with meaning, and dropped it into the toilet, watching it swirl down the drain until it was gone. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Maybe it was just a spoonful of sugar. Maybe it wasn't. But I never said a word. And she never asked again. The days that followed existed in a strange sort of suspended animation, like time itself had chosen to slow just enough to force us all into confronting the silence we'd spent a lifetime avoiding, and in that heavy, dragging quiet, every glance carried an accusation, every footstep down the hall seemed to echo too loudly, and every sentence, no matter how mundane, landed like a loaded question wrapped in artificial calm. There was something deeply unnatural about the way the air had shifted inside the house, like the structure itself knew something irreparable had occurred, something subtle and dangerous, something no one dared to name, but everyone felt in the marrow of their bones. Emily, to her credit, or perhaps her obliviousness, moved on as though the incident had simply been a strange, unfortunate blip in an otherwise charmed existence, and if she felt anything lingering in the wake of it all, she never said so. She bounced back quickly, almost too quickly, with that same familiar smile and that irritating little laugh that always struck me as a performance more than an expression, as though she were playing the role of Emily instead of just being her. She never asked about the tea, never questioned why it had made her feel like her lungs had turned against her, and never brought up the look on Mom's face when she dropped to her knees beside her, hands trembling, voice shaking, fear leaking out of her like a secret too big to contain. But Mom wasn't the same. Not anymore. There was a fracture behind her eyes now, a split down the center of her composure that she couldn't quite repair, no matter how much she tried to carry on like nothing had changed. She hovered more, stood just outside rooms with the pretense of doing something else, folding laundry that wasn't hers, watering plants that weren't wilting, and she watched me the way a person watches a closed door in the middle of the night, not knowing what's behind it, only certain that whatever it is has the potential to open. And the longer she stayed quiet, the more the distance between us became something permanent, something solid, something neither of us had the words to bridge. It wasn't long before the question finally came back, though not in the same clumsy form it had taken that first night. This time, it came with more calculation, less fear, and more strategy, as though she'd rehearsed the conversation in her mind a dozen times before daring to approach. She stood in the kitchen while I was cleaning out the sink, late in the evening when the lights outside had already begun to fade, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Her voice, when it came, was low and calm, but there was something brittle underneath it, like she was trying very hard not to tremble. "I keep thinking about that day," she said, not looking at me directly, her hands folded neatly in front of her like she didn't trust them to stay still on their own. "I keep going over it in my head, trying to understand what it was that I missed." I didn't respond immediately, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I wanted her to feel the weight of her own words before I gave her anything to soften them. She waited, and I could feel her growing restless under the silence, her need for reassurance clawing at the edges of her restraint. I finally turned, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "You didn't miss anything. You just ignored what was always there." It was a cruel thing to say, maybe, but not untrue. For years, I had watched her shape her version of reality like a potter sculpting clay, smoothing edges, hiding cracks, pretending that the thing she created was whole even when the pieces didn't fit. She had made Emily the center of that world, poured all her energy and affection into a daughter who never had to ask for it, and I had existed in the background like an afterthought, useful when needed, discarded when inconvenient. And for a long time, I'd played along, convinced that if I just waited long enough, if I just stayed quiet and patient and good, she'd notice me. She never did. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice tighter now, eyes narrowing just slightly, not because she didn't understand, but because she didn't like where it was going. I stepped closer, not out of anger, but with the same calm resolve that had guided me through the days since the incident. I said, "You're not afraid of what happened to Emily. You're afraid of realizing you never really knew me. That you raised someone for 43 years and never once asked yourself what it did to her to always be second." There was a long pause, and in that pause, something broke. Her eyes filled, not with tears exactly, but with something heavier, something closer to recognition, like she was seeing me clearly for the very first time and didn't like what she saw, not because I was wrong, but because she couldn't undo it. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to apologize, maybe to lie one more time just to keep the image intact, but I cut her off before she could say anything. "I'm not asking for an apology," I said, and my voice was calm, so calm it scared even me. "Not anymore. This time, I don't need you to explain it away or promise to do better. I don't want a card or a cake or a late-night cup of tea. I just want you to sit with what you've done. I want you to know that you had a daughter you chose not to see, and now you're terrified of what she's become." She didn't speak after that. She just stood there, frozen in place, the weight of my words pressing down on her shoulders until they sagged under the pressure. And when she finally turned and walked away, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. What I felt was something colder, something more permanent, the finality of having said what needed to be said and knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. That night, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees, a cup of tea in my hands, not the one she'd given me, not the one I'd handed off, but a new one, made by me, for me, and somehow it tasted different. Not sweeter, not warmer, just real. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't say sorry for how I felt. Not to her. Not to anyone. By the end of that week, the house had transformed into something I could only describe as a shared performance space, a quiet theater where everyone knew their lines but no longer believed in the script, where each conversation felt rehearsed and each smile worn like a costume that barely fit anymore, stretched thin by the strain of pretending that what had happened hadn't already shifted everything beneath our feet. There was a tension in the walls, subtle yet constant, as if the very foundation of our lives had started to hum with the unspoken, the unfinished, the unresolved, and each passing moment only served to deepen the discomfort, to sharpen the sense that nothing could return to what it once was, not even if we wanted it to. Emily, ever the master of denial, continued to drift through the house with the same glossy charm she'd always worn like a second skin, the kind that makes strangers lean in and family members overlook the small cruelties hiding behind her practiced smile. But this time there was something hollow behind her eyes, a quiet confusion that she couldn't quite articulate, as if her body remembered the fear from that night, the choking, the breathlessness, the disorientation, even if her mind had chosen to tuck it away behind curtains of distraction and illusion. She never brought it up again, not directly, not even in passing, and whether that was self-preservation or willful blindness, I couldn't say, though I found myself wondering more than once whether she'd allowed herself to believe it was just a fluke, a bad reaction, a random moment her body had betrayed her, because believing anything else would mean asking questions she was far too unequipped to ask. Our mother, however, was not afforded this same luxury of forgetfulness. While Emily floated above it all, Diana, still Mom in name, but somehow no longer in spirit, became a ghost of her former self, a woman unraveling thread by thread beneath the pressure of her own suspicions. And though she never confronted me again directly, I could feel the weight of her questions in every glance she sent my way, questions that trembled just behind her lips, but never found their way out because she feared the answers more than the silence. I would catch her watching me during dinner, her fork suspended midair, her eyes scanning my face not for affection or familiarity but for motive, as though she were trying to recognize someone in me that had never existed. Or perhaps someone who'd always been there, waiting for the moment she'd finally see. One evening, just as the summer light was beginning to fade into the amber hues of dusk, I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh mug of tea in my hands, not chamomile this time, but something sharper, spiced, fragrant, chosen deliberately for the way it lingered, and watched as both of them moved about the house, quiet but not at peace, speaking in half-thoughts and clipped tones, each pretending not to notice the other's unease. There was a moment, brief and strange, when Emily wandered into the kitchen, rubbing her throat with absent fingers, and glanced at the mug in my hand with the smallest twitch of something unreadable, hesitation, perhaps, or memory, and then, without a word, she walked away, her eyes never quite meeting mine. And then there was the moment that will stay with me forever, the moment that crystallized all the years of imbalance, of emotional drought, of being the invisible daughter standing just out of frame. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It didn't involve shouting or tears. It was quiet, devastatingly quiet. Mom stepped into the kitchen, her posture rigid, her hands tucked tightly into her sweater sleeves the way she used to do when she was nervous before church or doctor appointments, and she stood across from me, not sitting, not resting, just standing like a stranger deciding whether to enter a room she wasn't sure she belonged in anymore. Her eyes landed on the mug, and then on me, And for several seconds, she said nothing, just watched, searching for something, answers, maybe, or signs of mercy, or perhaps the version of me she had always refused to acknowledge. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I didn't blink. I lifted the mug, slowly, deliberately, and took a long, careful sip, letting the silence fill the space between us like smoke curling from a fire that hadn't quite gone out. She flinched, just slightly, the corner of her mouth twitching as if to form a word, but none came. There was no apology, no confrontation, no plea for forgiveness, only the look. That fractured, haunted, questioning look that said she had finally arrived at the precipice of knowing, but was too afraid to step forward and fall fully into it. In that moment, I realized something profound, not just about her or Emily or even myself, but about the nature of recognition, the kind that doesn't come from being seen, but from being feared. For the first time in my life, I had their attention, not as a problem to fix or a shadow to ignore, but as a force they couldn't quite understand, couldn't predict, couldn't control. And that power wasn't intoxicating in the way revenge fantasies often are. It was sobering. Steady. Earned. She didn't say goodbye when she left the room. She didn't even glance back. And I didn't stop her. That night, after they both went to bed, the house returned to its unnatural stillness, but this time I didn't feel invisible within it. I moved through it like someone who had finally taken ownership of her own story, who no longer needed validation from people too broken to give it, who no longer relied on birthday wishes or lukewarm tea or last-minute apologies to feel like she mattered. I stood by the window, watching the wind bend the branches outside, the tea cooling in my hands, and thought about how strange it was that something so simple, so small, could carry the weight of years, how the sound of a single cough could unravel a history of silence, how a glance held longer than usual could feel like justice or warning or both. I will never know for sure what they think happened. That's the truth I've made peace with. Maybe Emily convinced herself it was nothing, a fluke, an unfortunate mix of herbs and stress and timing. Maybe Mom believes I did something dark and deliberate, something cold and quiet and surgical, but can't bear to admit that possibility out loud because it would mean she failed at the one thing she took the most pride in, being a mother. Or maybe, deep down, they both know the truth, or at least their version of it, and choose, every day, not to speak it aloud, because once something is named, it becomes real, and some truths are too dangerous to live with in daylight. But me? I sleep just fine. Because in the end, I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't plead for understanding or fairness, or even a whisper of love. I handed over the tea. I looked her in the eye. And I said nothing. And sometimes, nothing is the loudest thing you'll ever hear.